Hello, friends. Welcome back to yet another episode of the MME, otherwise known as the Modern Meathead Experience. Last week, we talked a lot about range of motion. Okay, and I'm going to kind of expand on that topic with a little bit more of a deep dive into this whole conversation that a lot of us are now having around training in the most stretched positions. Now, this is something that Ethan and I have talked about a number of times and alluded to. I believe we have an entire episode just dedicated to this topic where we went sort of back and forth about it for a while. And I think that that was a great discussion. But I think I left some things out of that discussion and some details out of it that I would like to go over in depth today in this solo cast deep dive. So, for reference, and for all of you returning listeners, Ethan's competition is about 2 weeks away, 2 weeks from today, exactly, actually. So, in the coming weeks, you'll continue to hear some more solo casts. You'll continue to hear some episodes of podcasts that I've been on recently so that you can hear me in a little bit of a different light, sort of answering questions rather than just rambling in this sort of solo format. So, today, from a starting point perspective, I just want to contextualize this first. Many of you, if you're listening to this, have very likely heard previous episodes where we've talked about this lengthened partial conversation, but I just kind of want to give a brief overview of what it's all about first, so that those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar with it, or maybe you're new to the podcast, can get a little bit of context. And even if you are familiar with it, I think that this review of the topic will be helpful just from a data perspective, an overview perspective, and understanding sort of where this all comes from. So if you're at all involved in the online fitness space, the content creation game, or maybe you're just a regular content consumer, you're familiar with the fact that over this course, or over the course of the last year or so, there's been a lot of talk of this discussion of lengthened partials and what people are calling stretch mediated hypertrophy. Now, there are some nuances there insofar as the difference between those things. So today, we're just really going to focus on training in the lengthened position. That's going to kind of be the shtick for today. If you want to learn more about what stretch mediated hypertrophy is, Ethan actually recommended this podcast to me recently, the Stronger by Science podcast, and there's literally like a 4-hour episode on that. Now, most of you, if you're concerned about practical application, will not and probably should not listen to that episode, but I think it's a really great distillation of that topic. So today, again, we're talking about lengthened training, and what does that really mean, and what are people really excited about in relationship to it? Well, lengthened position training or lengthened partial training simply just refers to training a muscle in its more lengthened position, right? Kind of intuitive, kind of obvious, but should be said. And the way in which many, excuse me, of these exercises are differentiated relative to, we'll say, traditional exercises like full range of motion, quote unquote, exercises. If you want context around why I put quotes on full range of motion, you should listen to last week's episode. But the main difference between these more lengthened biased exercises, or these lengthened partial exercises, is that they all attempt to accomplish the goal of spending more total time under tension in the lengthened position. So what's an example of that, and what does that mean? Well, let's imagine I'm doing a leg extension exercise. Okay. And the arc of a leg extension goes from sort of being a little bit horizontal at the bottom to more sort of vertical at the top, where your foot at the bottom moves forward, and then your foot kind of moves and travels toward the ceiling, toward the end of the range. Now, the bottom end of that range, in the context of a leg extension, could be considered the lengthened portion of the range, meaning, just basically the portion of the leg extension where your foot doesn't start to travel upward. It's basically mostly traveling forward. So, if any of you can sort of visualize this now, it's basically just the bottom 50% of a leg extension, right? Put simply. And that would be considered a sort of lengthened partial within the context of a leg extension. It doesn't mean it's a lengthened partial in terms of all the muscles that are acting in that situation, which I'll talk about in a second. But it does mean that per that exercise and per defining a leg extension, a full range leg extension in the way that we traditionally do, the lengthened partial version of it would just be doing simply the bottom 50% or so. Now, the full range version of it would be sort of intuitive to many of you. You're just going all the way from the bottom to all the way to the top. And the full range of motion exercise thing has been a little bit debunked, just in the sense that we now have evidence to suggest that we don't necessarily need to use the full range of every single exercise that we do to yield substantial hypertrophic outcomes. And in fact, what this whole lengthened partial conversation is really about is it's about this idea that there may be some relevance and some credence to actually intentionally not using the full range of motion of any particular exercise and rather using the lengthened half or the lengthened 60 to 70% of the range of motion. So what do we have insofar as the research and data that can support this? Well, in the context of leg extensions, there was one study done by Pedrosa and colleagues in 2021, which essentially actually showed greater hypertrophy of the quadriceps using the longer length partial variation as compared to the full range of motion leg extension and the partial range of motion extension just at the top. Right. So that sort of is introducing a third variation of this conversation, which could be, okay, maybe I'll do the full range leg extension all the way from the bottom to all the way to the top, but maybe I'll do just the bottom half, i.e. the lengthened partial, but maybe I'll just do the top half, i.e. a shortened partial or a more squeezed position partial, where it's exactly what it sounds like. Instead of doing the full range or just the bottom, you would simply just cut out the bottom and do the top half of the range, where again, your foot would be sort of more traveling vertically toward the ceiling and toward the floor directly. Now, there's another similar study by McMahon in 2014, which actually saw similar results in the lateral quadriceps. Now, we've seen this effect in other scenarios, I believe 5 or 6 other different scenarios, one of which was a study done by Mao in 2020, which actually showed greater hypertrophy of the hamstrings when trained at longer lengths in the seated leg curl versus the lying leg curl. One of which was done by Sato in 2021, which showed greater hypertrophy in the elbow flexor muscles when training them at longer lengths as compared to shorter lengths. Another of which was done by Mao in 2022, the same research group that looked at the hamstring stuff. And they showed that all 3 heads of the triceps actually grew more with the overhead extension as compared to a neutral arm extension. Now, there are some studies, for example, by Stasinaki et al. In 2018, which actually showed in the case of the triceps that there was no difference in outcome between triceps long head hypertrophy doing the overhead versus the neutral extension. And so that's just something to keep in mind, and that's going to raise a very important point that we're going to touch on a little bit later. So a couple of the studies that I mentioned just now were not contextually the same as the leg extension example I gave to begin with. So the leg extension example that I gave to begin with just compared the full range of motion leg extension to just the bottom half partial. So we're taking the same exact motion, right? In both cases, we're doing a leg extension, but in one case, we're using the bottom half, and in another, we're using the full range. Now, the study that I mentioned by what's his name? Mao in 2020, they compared seated leg curls to lying leg curls. So to the point that I mentioned briefly earlier, when I said that the long length versus short length partials within the context of a leg extension are not necessarily referring to muscle length, what I meant by that was that, we'll say in the context of the leg extension, all of the single joint knee extensors, the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, the vastus intermedius, those 3 guys are essentially being trained through most of their full range. But for any of you that are familiar with quadriceps anatomy or anatomy in general, you know that there's one quad, the rectus femoris, which actually crosses both the hip and the knee, which essentially means that because that quad crosses the front of the hip, that in the context of a leg extension, because you're in a seated position, the muscle length of the rectus femoris would actually not be maximized, whether you're doing the long length partial or whether you're doing the full range. And so the way, for example, in this case, that you would actually maximally lengthen the rectus femoris is by doing something like, a rear foot elevated split squat, right? Where the back leg would actually be fully stretched in the context of the rectus femoris, and where the front leg actually wouldn't, right? Because both the hip and the knee are moving. So if that was at all complex or was a little bit muddy to understand, just understand that when we say long length partial, oftentimes we may be referring to not just the muscle length itself, but where in the range we're utilizing. But we also could be referring to the total muscle length, as in the case of the mouse study, right, which looked at seated leg curls versus lying leg curls. So in both cases, what they did in that study was they compared the full range of each of those exercises. And because each of those exercises puts the hips in a different position, the length of the hamstrings, at least the ones that cross the hip, is actually distinct. So just to review briefly, if I'm doing a seated leg curl where my hips are more bent, that is going to put the hamstrings, the three of the four that cross the hip, at a longer average muscle length as compared to the lying leg curl, where the lying leg curl, because your hip is relatively straight, meaning that your femur is close to parallel with your torso, that would actually train a shorter total muscle length of your hamstrings despite going through the exact same knee range of motion, right? So in both the seated and the lying leg curl, you're moving your knee, if you're doing a full range of motion leg curl or seated leg curl, lying leg curl, you're moving your knee through its full excursion, right? Full bending to full straightening, and you're controlling for that range. But Mao, that study, did not actually look at the differences between just using part of a leg curl in either case. In other words, it's not like in the leg extension example, they did two seated leg curls, one of which used the top half, one of which used the bottom half. They basically just looked at, okay, if I compare seated leg curls to lying leg curls, what will yield more hypertrophy in the hamstrings? And it ended up being the case that the seated leg curl yielded more hypertrophy than the lying leg curl. And the theory is that this was because the hamstrings are put at a longer average muscle length in the case of the seated leg curl as compared to the lying leg curl. Okay, so we have multiple things happening at once. And what I want to talk about today and potentially debunk, or not necessarily debunk, but just provide clarity into, is this conversation in general, meaning that I'm not going to specifically refer to either one of these things, but more both of them as a whole. And just the concept of training either at a longer muscle length, number one, or at a longer muscle length in tandem with using longer length partials. So again, this conversation can get very muddied because we have to be specific about which of those two things we're talking about. We might be talking about both simultaneously. We might be talking about one or the other. But today, and what I'm going to talk about here, is specifically in relationship to either one of those things. Okay, so using a longer average muscle length or simply using the longer portion of a range of motion in the context of a single exercise like a leg extension. Now, for reference, there are, to my estimation or to my understanding, fewer than 10 studies that have really directly compared these things in a one-to-one vacuum type setting, because that's ultimately what this research is elucidating, right? What the research is not saying is, hey, let's compare doing a combination of long and short work to long work alone or short work alone. What it's doing is it's usually taking either two exercises and comparing them, like the seated lying leg curls, or what it's doing is it's taking the same exercise and sort of cutting that exercise up into different portions and saying, hey, which of these two variations seem to yield better outcomes or more hypertrophic outcomes? So, and that's all it's doing, right? That's all these studies are doing. They're not looking at this on a really chronic scale. They're not looking at these results over the course of 6 months. They're not looking at a combination of exercises and how the combination of exercises compares to just doing one or the other. They're not looking at, combining different variations of the long and short work with just the long work or just the short work. At least not at this point. We don't have data to sort of elucidate what outcomes those things might yield. So, what's important to remember first, okay, and this is sort of the summary of the introduction section here, is that we don't have much research on this topic. Now, a lot of people that have been talking about this long length thing, again, whether it's referring to lengthened half of the range of motion of the same exercise or two distinct ones, one of which trains the muscle at a longer versus a shorter length, we just simply don't have a ton of data. Like we literally have fewer than 10 studies that are directly comparing these things. And so that in and of itself should sort of allow you to throw a flag on the play, let's say, when you hear anyone speaking in any degree of really, really certain terms about the topic. Now, overall, what we can say and what we can reasonably conclude is that on average, based on the data that we currently have, it seems that longer biased work tends to yield more hypertrophic outcomes in a 1-to-1 scenario in a vacuum as compared to shorter muscle length variations. That's all we can really reasonably conclude. And what you'll notice is if you actually read any of these studies, any single one of these studies, at no point will you hear any of these researchers, i.e., the people actually in the trenches doing this research and understanding these topics more than anyone else. What you will not hear them conclude is long length training is better than short length training. No one will say that. No one in their right mind who is a researcher will conclude that. Inevitably, what all of these researchers have come to is, hey, at this point, this is what we seem to observe. This does not mean that you should just take all of your exercises and make all of them length and bias. This does not mean you should only train at long muscle lengths. This does not mean that you should completely ignore shortened work because shortened work is stupid and useless. What they're saying is, hey, here's the data that we have and here's what we've found. And that's all they're saying. So the first major point to make and the takeaway from this introductory section is simply that we don't have a lot of research on this topic, right? Compare fewer than 10 studies to, say, something like the research on creatine, which has been elucidated over the last decade plus, 2 decades, which, in the context of creatine, there are literally thousands of studies, if not over 1,000 studies on the topic of creatine. So that's an example, right, of a situation in a field of research in which we can say much more confidently, like, hey, these are the things that creatine does. These are the downsides. These are the upsides. These are the people that have complications, generally speaking. These are the people that don't. And because that body of research is so large and because it's been so well elucidated and the effects of creatine have been so deeply studied, we can be much more confident about the recommendation of creatine across most populations, or at least many of them, as compared to this situation, which is in its very, very, very infancy. Okay. And so just for context, like something that has been studied at length, which by the way, you don't need 1,000 studies, right, to be more confident about a conclusion, but you certainly can't make confident conclusions, or at least I don't think that you should, based on 10 or fewer studies. Now, depending on who you're talking to, some people might extrapolate data from another 10 or 20 studies, and they might say, okay, there's 20 to 25 to 30 studies that are talking about this topic. And I would say that at least indirectly, that's not untrue. But what I would say is that if we're talking about direct research on the topic, again, fewer than 10 studies have really been done specifically on what we're talking about today. So that's the first thing to really note is anytime that you hear someone talking about this in absolutes with high degrees of certainty, throw a flag on the play. Alarm bells in your head should sort of be going off. And we're going to talk about now a lot of the confounders that I believe are contributing to this whole thing that over the long term and really over the acute term, I think we'll start to elucidate this a little bit more in terms of why we might be seeing some trends and why, in addition, you shouldn't be making super strong claims, especially given these confounding variables. So let's look at some of the problems with just the interpretation, if you can even call it that, by the general public. So the first thing to consider is that, and I'm going to stick just for now with the example of the leg extension so that we can stay pretty concrete with it. The first thing that we need to consider in my estimation, and some other very important variables that are confounders, meaning that there are other variables that are existing simultaneously that can muddy the water of these results that we're seeing. The first of which is stability. Okay. Now, stability in exercise is kind of a smoke bomb term. So let's define it. I like to think of stability as a resistance of motion. So, you can think of stability in a lot of different ways. Any kind of contraction will create some degree of stability around a joint or joints. But I think to understand stability, we really need to understand the concept of a counterforce. Okay. So what is a counterforce and what is an example of a counterforce? A counterforce is essentially any force which opposes another force to create balance or to resist motion in a system. That's it. Okay. So I'll repeat that. A counterforce is any force or force direction which in relationship to another force creates balance or resists motion. So an example that I think is very, very clear cut to use, has nothing to do with exercise, is the process of opening a soda can, okay, or a can of seltzer. So if any of you have opened a soda can or a can of seltzer, which many of you likely have at this point, what you will know, or maybe what you can observe, is that if you unconsciously, if you close your eyes and you have a soda can in front of you, how will you open that soda can? Well, more than likely, assuming you have two hands, you will grab the soda can with, let's say, your left hand. Okay. And so that's already introducing a counter force to what you're trying to do, which we'll talk about in a second. So you'll grab the can, let's say, with the left hand. And what you'll do next is you'll plant your thumb on the end of the can, right? And if you're watching this, right, it's basically like you're grabbing with one hand, you plant your thumb with the other, and then with your index finger or your middle finger or both of them, you put your hand or your finger underneath of the tab, right? That's going to open the can, and you pull up on it. Now, many of us take this intuitive understanding of physics for granted, right? In other words, we don't really have to think about what we're doing to open the can. We just do it. But the question here and what I'm trying to elucidate is exactly why we do that. And I'm going to relate it to exercise in just a second. So again, you're going to open a can of soda and you grab it with your left hand, plant with the right thumb, and open it with the right index finger, the right middle finger, or both of those things. What are you unconsciously doing in order to open the can? Well, the first thing that you're doing is you're grabbing it. Okay. So you're essentially creating a situation where you're creating a counter force with your opposite hand so that when you go to pull on the tab, the whole can doesn't just fall over in a single direction. Now, in addition to this, many of you can probably open, like if you're doing something with your offhand, if you want to call it that, what you actually can do is you can open the can with a single hand, but the only way that you can actually open it, right, is if you plant your thumb to pull up on the tab. Why? Well, because if you don't plant your thumb and push down on the can, you actually cannot pull up on the tab, because if you pull up on the tab without your other hand or without planting your thumb, the whole fucking can just falls over, right? Which is, that's good for no one. Okay. We end up with a spilled drink. We're pissed. Maybe the drink spills all over our technology. Whatever other number of things can occur that will make that situation not ideal. Okay. So what is the purpose of this example and what does it tell us about exercise? Well, it essentially tells us that in order to create motion, we need stability. But what is stability? Stability is just creating other kinds of force. And so, if any of you are familiar with this concept of anchoring, and, I talk about anchoring and the concept of it a lot, anchoring is essentially this, right? We are anchoring the can with our opposite hand. We are anchoring the can with our same side thumb so that we can press up on the tab or pull up on the tab so that the whole can doesn't fall over, right? We are essentially introducing forces that are necessary to accomplish the task that we're trying to do. And we can think about this in exactly the same way when it comes to exercise. So let's go back to our leg extension example and let's talk about counter forces in a leg extension. Many of you know that when you sit down on a leg extension, there are handles on the leg extension, right, by your sides. And the reason that there are handles on the leg extension, the reason those handles are there in the first place is so that you can hold them. Now, the question is, why would you need to hold the handles on a leg extension when you could just start kicking? Well, because as many of you know, if you put any appreciable amount of load on the leg extension and you try to start to move it, your entire body, right, from basically your knee upward, your knee to your femur to your hip to your spine and the rest of your upper body, it will start moving all over the place if you don't actually hold yourself in position, right? And the same concept can be applied to other exercises. Why do we have a thigh pad on a lat pull down? Why do we have a thigh pad on a seated leg curl? Why do we lie down on benches to do presses, right? It's all fundamentally about this concept of stability, anchoring, and creating counter forces so that we can limit motion where we don't want motion to occur, and simultaneously so that we can be precise about the action that we're trying to create. Okay. So in the context of a leg extension, the equivalent of not holding the soda can down, the equivalent of not planting your thumb to open the tab is the same as not grabbing the handles on the leg extension, right? Because when you don't grab the handles on a leg extension and you're using a high amount of load, your body will be pushed upward toward the ceiling. Now, how the fuck does this relate to lengthened and shortened work? Well, in the context of a leg extension, and I really encourage all of you experientially to try this, right? So the next time you do leg extensions, I want you to try exactly what I'm recommending, or really I want you to try to do a couple of different things to elucidate this concept experientially, because to some degree you can understand these concepts just by me verbal vomiting here and learning about the concepts. But unless you experience it for yourself, you won't know exactly what it actually feels like, and you won't have a good idea of how these concepts are actually concrete and how they apply to lifting. So let's look at the two different leg extensions examples, right? One of which is the full range of motion, so going all the way from bottom to top. And the next of which is just using the bottom half of the range. If you just use the bottom half of the range, the amount of counterforce that you need to create pulling yourself down into the seat will be relatively lower compared to the short position. So I'll say that in another way. When you use the bottom half of the range as compared to the full range of motion of a leg extension, the amount of force that is trying to pull you up and out of the seat is lower. So what does that mean? That means that you essentially have to put less effort into holding yourself down into the seat. And so that, relatively speaking, you can actually dedicate more effort into simply just performing the leg extension. And as a consequence of that, you may potentially experience more local force and more local tension in the quadriceps muscles as a consequence of doing this. So if you are doing just the bottom portion of a leg extension, you can essentially use more load. And in addition to that, you have to put less force, or you're required to put less force into holding yourself down. If you use the full range of motion, even if it's with less force or less total load rather on the leg extension itself, the stability requirement will elevate. And the reason that the stability requirement of a full range leg extension elevates is essentially because of how the force direction of the leg extension changes. A good way to think about this concretely is essentially like picture a seesaw, right? At the top of the leg extension, there's much stronger of a seesawing effect as compared to the bottom because of how the resistance relates to your body. And I won't get too depth into that because it would require a lot of visual diagramming or demonstration to really elucidate it. But hopefully, again, you all try this experientially. Do a full range of motion leg extension with, 100 pounds, just whatever number it happens to be. And then just do the bottom portion of the range. Of course, you're doing less total work just using part of the range, so you can use more load. But I think a bigger factor is actually the fact that it's actually a lot more stable in a one-to-one setting. And so what that means is, again, you have to put less effort into holding yourself down. And because you have to put less effort into holding yourself down, you're actually able to dedicate more effort just to using the quads and creating tension in the quads to perform the motion. So already we have one major confounder between the two scenarios. Of course, muscle length is an influence. Of course, the technique involved with full range versus partial range is an influence. Of course, the total distance that you're moving is an influence, and the resistance profile of the machine, which we'll talk about in a second, is an influence. But just to introduce this one concept at a time, the range of motion that you use in any exercise will directly impact how stable you are and how much counterforce you have to create. And as a consequence of that, the relative amounts of effort that you have to put in to things like creating stability and counterforces in something like a leg extension or any other similar motion. Okay. And this applies to all motions, not just the leg extension. And so to sort of extrapolate that more broadly, this occurs in every exercise. Now, the specific intricacies of each exercise will change depending on the forces, obviously, and the positions and the change in positions and how you're moving within those exercises. But I hope that was helpful in sort of elucidating this concept of anchoring, and specifically how, generally speaking, now I'll conclude that only using partial ranges, whether it's a shortened partial or a lengthened partial, tends to make things a little bit simpler for our bodies. Now, in the case of the shortened partial of a leg extension, you're dealing with more total counterforces that you need to resist. And so that's, in my estimation, a major player in creating or being able to create more output in the bottom portion of the leg extension. All right, so that's confounding variable number one, is just this concept of stability and how much we actually need to focus on stability and put effort into stability as compared to motion, right? And so again, that soda can example, although it's simple in many ways and sort of seemingly trite and doesn't seem to relate directly, I think it's one of the most, we'll say, illuminating things that you can apply to the gym. So that's confounder number one, is, different ranges of motion require different amounts of stability. Different amounts of stability and the requirement of stability allows for different kinds of efforts, more or less, depending on what range of motion you're using, right? So again, that bottom partial of the leg extension, easier to stabilize, more output compared to the short. Now, what's another confounder? Another confounder is resistance profile. Now, Ethan and I have done a lot of different episodes, at least, where we've either talked directly about resistance profiles or we've alluded to them a lot. So I would highly recommend, if you are interested in learning more about resistance profiles, check out those episodes. But just to sort of briefly recap, resistance profiles in any exercise simply just describe where an exercise is heavier and lighter. And a more granular way to say that is that resistance profiles describe torque changes within the context of a single exercise. Now, there are a lot of overlapping things that contribute to resistance profiles. So I'm just going to isolate for and potentially oversimplify this conversation by focusing on one example. So some of the studies that have been done, mainly the one that I'm going to concentrate on now is this one around elbow flexors and elbow flexor recruitment. There was a study done by, I believe, Zabaleta, if that's how you say it, et al. And this was basically a study that compared incline dumbbell curls to preacher curls. And basically what they found was that preacher curls far outperformed the incline curls. And this will come hand in hand with the stability conversation. I'm going to tie it in. So let's imagine that you're doing two different kinds of curls. Again, one of which is an incline curl, where if many of you are not familiar, just Google incline dumbbell curl. You'll see what it looks like. And they were comparing the incline dumbbell curl to a dumbbell preacher curl. And there are a couple major differences. And one of the major differences between these two is in the resistance profile of these two exercises. So just to sort of get right to the point, the incline curl is much heavier toward the top end of the range, meaning the mid to short position of the elbow flexor muscles in this case. And the preacher curl, based on the way that it's set up, at least in the study, is set up in a way where the resistance profile is much more biased toward the lengthened position. So in simple terms, what that means is that the incline curl is heavier toward a squeezed position, and the preacher curl is heavier toward a more stretched position. And what they found was the more stretched position of the preacher curl actually yielded higher returns in hypertrophy than the incline curl. Now, this is interesting, right? Because if you know biceps anatomy, you know that the incline curl done with a dumbbell actually stretches the average length of the biceps more, or creates more length on average in the biceps as compared to the preacher curl, because the preacher curl is done with the arm in front of the body. But nevertheless, the preacher curl actually outperformed the more stretched incline curl, despite the fact that the incline curl was done at a longer muscle length. So this is interesting, right? Because now, to our earlier conversation, we're really drawing the distinction between where is the exercise heavy in terms of the range that you're using, and what is the length of the muscle? Because again, those two things aren't the same. And what this study really elucidates is the fact that there is more to this conversation than just the muscle length alone, which again is the thing that all people only seem to be focusing on. They don't seem to be focusing on these confounders. So what we learned from this whole resistance profile conversation is that perhaps it might be the case that exercises which are heavier toward more lengthened positions are actually the exercises in which we see more growth. Now, in the context of a leg extension, where we're just comparing the same muscle lengths, just different portions within that range, this is not something that's elucidated. But in this example of the preacher versus the incline curl, we have a sort of much bigger picture, or a much more clear picture of what might actually be making the difference. Now, what are some confounders, even in the context of this resistance profile thing? Well, think about the conversation we just had around counterforce. In the incline curl, if your arms are just hanging at your sides behind your body, you don't actually have a direct counterforce off of which you can do the curl, right? There is nothing behind the backside of the arm when you're doing that curl. But in the preacher curl, there is a direct counterforce, i.e., there is a direct sort of thumb on the soda can, opposite hand on the soda can thing, which is actually allowing the people who are doing the preacher curl to create more force in that bottom end position, or really in all positions of that exercise. Because what it's doing is, as we discussed in the case of the leg extension, is it's decreasing the stability requirement, right? And so in addition to the fact that the preacher curl was on average much heavier toward the lengthened stretch portion of the range, the preacher curl is also more stable, meaning that there is a direct counterforce that we can create elbow flexion or elbow curling against. And this is interesting, right? Because now we're starting to layer another sort of layer onto the cake, or we're starting to put another layer onto the cake, which is that we have this resistance profile thing, which tells us, okay, where is this thing actually heavier within the context of emotion? But now we also have this counterforce stability anchoring thing, which adds another layer of, well, how much force do I have to create to just manage the stability of the motion versus how much force can I create that actually contributes to the goal? And the goal of any curling motion, as far as I'm concerned, is to train the muscles that bend the elbow. And so if I'm going to try to train any muscle that bends the elbow, I damn well better have a counterforce off of which I can actually minimize the stability forces, in this case at the shoulder, where I can maximize forces on the elbow. So two different layers here and two additional confounders, one of which is, the counterforce stability conversation, and another which is what range of motion, or what portion of the range of motion rather, that you're actually loading most, right? Are you loading more of the lengthened portion of the range, i.e., are you using a resistance profile which is more biased toward the stretch, or are you loading more of the short position, as in the incline curl, where you are loading more of the mid to shortened portion of the contractile length? And again, these two things are entirely different. These two things don't directly have to do with muscle length, but they are confounders. In other words, they are other variables that are concomitantly existing in addition to this muscle length thing, right? So already I've only discussed two things and the slight overlaps or the cases in which they're overlapping. And, I don't know how excuse me, how many minutes I'm into this conversation, right? But at the end of the day, even if we've only introduced two confounders, we have other two variables that are heavily, heavily influential on our ability to create tension and output in any one of these motions, right? So already, again, to that concept of the red flag, the moment that you see anyone focusing on any single one of these variables, doesn't matter if it's stability, doesn't matter if it's a resistance profile, doesn't matter if it's muscle length, they're missing a huge, huge part of the picture because there's not this concomitant discussion of these other variables, which directly contribute to motion. And to be honest, even more than the muscle length conversation, I think counterforce and stability is probably the biggest player here. That's just my theory. That's my estimation, but it makes the most amount of sense to me because what will determine how precisely we can actually target a tissue, and as a consequence of that, how much tension we can create in that tissue, is going to be how stable we are and how much we actually have to manage things that we're not trying to train versus how well we're actually able to create output relative to that. So those are two confounders: stability counterforce, number one, resistance profile, number two, the overlap between those two, and then also how they relate to muscle length. All right. So the third major confounder here, and I'm just picking three, there are probably many more, and the interaction between all these things just gets infinitely more complicated in terms of each individual case, right? So I'm trying to give a broad outline, do my best here, is simply the concept of novelty. Okay. So I was talking to Ethan recently, and he was asking me, hey, Ben, what flavor of Skittle artificial flavoring do you like in your pre-workout drink? Because Ethan has these awesome concoctions that he creates for his intra pre-workout drinks, post-workout drinks, whatever. And there are some artificial flavorings, that he puts into the drinks, and I had been stealing them. And he asked me, hey, Ben, which one of these flavors is your favorite? And, I think back on, the couple months I've been using these different flavored drinks, intra-workout drinks. And I basically came to the conclusion that my favorite one was actually whatever one was most novel, meaning whichever one I had used recently the least, and whichever one was newest to me. And the effect of novelty in exercise, and specifically research around exercise, really cannot be overstated in terms of its influence. Why? Excuse me. Well, imagine a scenario where you're doing a study. And imagine, just for now, this would be ridiculous, but imagine you only had two people doing the study. And let's say you're comparing the effect of leg extensions on quad growth versus squats on quad growth. And one person has done no leg extensions ever and no squats ever. And the other person has done both squats and leg extensions for a very long time. From a relative perspective, which one of these two people do you think will experience more quad growth having done leg extensions and squats? Again, both people are doing both. Which one of these two individuals do you think will experience more growth? In my estimation, and I can't say this with certainty, but with about 99% confidence, that the person who has not done leg extensions or squats will experience an exponentially greater amount of growth doing both of those exercises as compared to the person that has already been doing them for months, right? And this is yet another confounder that we see in this conversation, where a profound influence, I believe, on the research that we're seeing and the elucidation of this research simply has to do with the fact that very few people already going into research settings are actually doing these long length partial things intentionally, right? Some people are doing them accidentally. They're just using partial ranges and they're using more load than they maybe can handle in the mid and the short range. And so as a consequence, they end up just doing lengthened partials on a lot of their exercises. But in my estimation, that's probably not a majority of people, and probably a majority of people that are participating in these studies are not actually doing lengthened work at all in their program, and they're more than likely doing shortened biased and full range biased work, just because that's kind of the baseline of where a lot of people end up, just trying to do full range of motion at every exercise. Most exercises, most of the time, end up being very, very difficult toward the mid and short positions, and they end up relatively stressing the lengthened position less. So I think this is a huge variable that not a lot of people are talking about. Some people are talking about the stability and the muscle length thing and the resistance profile thing, but not a lot of people are talking about this conversation of, hey, how many of these participants have actually been doing these exercises, these long length partial exercises to begin with? Because I'm willing to bet money on the fact that many of them aren't to begin with. So the outcome that these people experience may simply be a consequence of the novelty. And in addition to the novelty, the timeline of these experiments, right? So in research, we are limited, practically speaking, by timelines, right? There are not going to be very many people, if ever, who are willing to do studies that are 6 months, 8 months, 12 months long. And, from a practical standpoint, the budget that these studies have would just scale enormously if the timeline scaled, right? So you would have to be spending tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually pay participants to do a study for more than 12, 16 weeks at a time. And even in the time frame of 12 to 16 weeks, I would be very curious to actually see, like, okay, if you took two groups of people, and one group was doing, let's say, 80% partial work in the length of position, and then 20% short and sort of mid work. And then you sort of flip flop that for the other group where, they were doing 80% mid to short range motions and 20% partials. With those transient effects, those transient hypertrophic effects of the 12 to 16 week or 8 to 16 week studies, would they actually start to dissipate and lower in terms of their influence on outcome over a longer time period? And again, my estimation is yes, that they would. And right now, we just don't have the data to suggest that longer length partials will be better than training full range or training shortened range or a combination of those things over a very long time period. And so this is kind of where I land us at a more reasonable middle ground, which is to say that because we don't have the data that I previously mentioned about even just comparing, doing long length and short length work together versus only long length work, and also because we don't have these results elucidated on a longer timeline, I think that we should be very hesitant to conclude that we should either only be doing long length partials or that long length partials and stretch work is just inherently better. Right. And for reference, and this may be somewhat tangential, there is actually data to recommend, or rather, sorry, to elucidate the fact that training and really dividing and conquering between long and shortened work together versus only doing long work, there is data to suggest that strength gains and I forget which particular context this was specific to. It might have even been leg extensions and squats, where studies actually showed that doing short range of motion exercises or doing full range of motion exercises in tandem with the long length work actually outperformed from a strength perspective only doing long length work or only doing full range work. Meaning that, in the context of a leg extension, to bring this back to concrete reality, doing the full range of motion leg extension plus the long length leg extension would theoretically be synergistic as compared to something like only doing long length partials or only doing, full range of motion. Meaning that if you are training the entire contractile length with full challenge through either position or through either exercise, I estimate that that will be synergistic rather than additive. And what that essentially means is that instead of, five adding five, meaning instead of 5 plus 5 equals 10, you could potentially yield an effect of 5 times 5, which, for you math geniuses out there would be 25. You would potentially experience a scenario in which training the full range and challenging the full range with different and sort of divided options would be much better than just training one kind of motion, whether it be full range, or one kind of motion if it's just the long length partial or just the short length partial. We just don't know. We just don't know how these things actually will end up influencing outcome. Now, to practically recommend things and to again sort of draw this back to reality, I think that a reasonable takeaway from the current data should be that long muscle lengths and short muscle lengths absolutely influence hypertrophy and strength outcomes. There's no doubt about that. But the kind of conclusion that people are drawing, which basically says that only do long leg training, only do the long partials, only do the stretch, or prioritize the stretch at all costs. I think that's way too many steps ahead of where we're currently at in terms of what we can really understand and potentially predict. And so if you end up making blanket sort of conclusions and recommendations that longer muscle length training is just superior to shorter muscle length training, then I think that you would be wrong because you're ignoring all of these other confounding and relevant variables which contribute to the outcomes and the total tensions and all those things like counterforces, profiles, novelty that contribute to outcomes over the medium and the long term. So I think that using a combination of these exercises, in other words, doing the long length partial leg extension, but also in the same workout or in the same week, doing a full range or a partial range leg extension toward the short position or the mid range position with appropriate counterforces, with profiles that challenge those relative goals together is likely to yield the best outcome for hypertrophy. And to say that simply, I think at this particular point, and I would really be interested to see how this is, made clear over the coming years or over the coming months, I think that training the full range and training the challenge to the full range is going to be the best bet. And not only the best bet for hypertrophy and strength, but I think also the best bet in terms of a recoverability standpoint, a total fatigue standpoint, in terms of an orthopedic health standpoint, a muscle health standpoint, a connective tissue standpoint. I think that we can't really go wrong at this point with choosing a selection of exercises which ultimately all challenge the entirety of a range of motion of a muscle. I just don't think that we can go wrong with that right now. So I believe that, essentially ignoring sort of any single variable is a bad idea. Ignoring multiple variables is certainly a bad idea for sure. And while these conclusions that I'm making are speculative to some degree, again, there is some data to support that it could be a synergistic effect, at least in strength, training multiple ranges. And at the current time, I am training full ranges of motion on some sets. I'm training partial ranges of motion on others. So to sort of wrap this up, again, and just to review, and then I'll make a practical recommendation with a practical example of my own training. I recommend that you need to pay attention to resistance profiles. In other words, you need to pay attention to where an exercise is hard. In tandem with that, and not separate from that, in tandem with that, you need to pay attention to using appropriate counterforces and stability, right? Making sure that you're using the handles of a leg extension, you have something behind your arm on a curl, you're using the lat pull down pad for your thighs, you're using the thigh pad for a seated leg curl, etc. You're using machines when it's relevant. And that you make sure that you prioritize those two things in addition to the muscle length thing. And an example of prioritizing training the full length would, in a practical way, be, doing leg extensions on a given day. So let's take an example that's concrete from yesterday's training that I did. I did 5 or 6 sets. I did 6 sets of leg extensions. My first 2 sets, I trained the entire range from bottom to top, and I used pauses at the top actually to emphasize the top position, the squeeze position. And I did both of those sets to failure. Now, whether you do it single or double leg, different conversation, but I was doing them single leg. Okay. So I did 2 sets to begin with, which, I was training full range. And where I stopped those exercises was basically when I couldn't get to the top of the range of motion, I would fail, I would fatigue in the short position. And when I couldn't do, I essentially didn't go into partials, I just stopped, right? So first 2 sets, full range of motion, stop when I couldn't get to the top. And then my next 4 sets, I actually did 3 of them just in the bottom half of the range. And I was able to escalate load about 20%. Stability, as I mentioned, was a little bit easier to manage. Output, as a consequence, went up. Obviously, I'm using lower amounts of range of motion. I'm using a range of motion potentially where the muscle is stronger, where I can create more tension in that portion of the range. So load literally scaled by like 20, 25% or something like that for the same amount of reps. So 2 sets to begin with. I failed at the top position. I stopped when I couldn't get to the top. The following 3 sets, I did long length partials where I was just doing the bottom half of the range, again, escalating load. And then my last set was just a drop set where I basically dropped a lot of range. And then I went through the full range of motion all the way into partials and fatiguing those things. So that's an example of where, yes, I'm still just isolating for one sort of length of the rectus femoris, but I'm training it within the context of that length through its full shortened range, through its mid range, and then some exercises to train the lengthened or bottom portion of that range more specifically. So that to me is a little bit more of a sensible middle ground, which is to say, hey, I'm giving credence to this longer muscle length thing, but I'm also making sure that I don't ignore counterforces and I don't ignore the influence of resistance profiles in my conceptualization of that. And I'm making sure that I'm not super biased in my volume toward one or the other, but potentially because of this longer length thing and because I can create more total tension and more output in that bottom half, maybe I'll just do an additional set in that bottom half of the range, just because right now it seems practically, we'll say, sensible based on the current data that we have. So I hope this was helpful. I hope maybe you heard some things, learned some things that you hadn't thought about or learned about before, maybe hadn't heard other people talk about before. I'm very interested to kind of see how this line of research continues to be elucidated, and if we can actually understand things a little bit more in the context of all these variables simultaneously, comparing anchored variations to non-anchored variations while you standardize for resistance profile, comparing long length variations in terms of the muscle length with standardized resistance profiles to shorter length variations with similar resistance profiles. All that information will be super interesting to sort of see elucidated over the coming months and years. So as usual, thank you all for listening. If you've made it to this point in the podcast, you're a real one. In the coming weeks, I'll be posting up some podcasts that I've been on as a guest, as I did a couple of weeks ago. Again, I think those things can be helpful just because, you can only, I think, learn and glean so much by me and myself just talking to my screen and just by sort of rambling on and verbal vomiting, where someone can, in the case of a podcast, sort of help me clarify certain things if they're at all muddied. So thanks for all of you who have listened up to this point. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll see you all next week.